Welcome, everybody. We will begin right now. Shalom and welcome. I'm Jessie Sheslow, the Director of Community Relations at the Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee. Thank you for joining this Heller CRC webinar, Intergenerational Conversations about Zionism. I am thrilled to have Carly Pildis as our guest presenter today. The Jewish Federation of Sarasota-Manatee's mission is to strengthen Jewish life and identity in our community, provide for Jewish people in need, and promote support for Israel. Therefore, we are thrilled to provide our community with new and innovative programs virtually, especially in a time of such uncertainty. This webinar, Intergenerational Conversations about Zionism, is such an important conversation to have, especially as we are on the cusp of so much change in our country. I hear often, and from many of you tuning in today, that it is increasingly difficult to speak to your children and grandchildren about Israel and Zionism. I'd like to mention that this is not a webinar dissecting Israeli policies, new or old. The goal of today's session is for you to glean that there are different ways to be a Zionist. Learn from Carly so that you and your family may begin to speak a similar language when it comes to Israel. After Carly presents, we will go to questions. You may ask at any time during the presentation. Please use the chat box to do so. This webinar is being recorded, and please note that the opinions of our guests today do not necessarily reflect those of the Jewish Federation. You are watching the Heller CRC's Intergenerational Conversations about Zionism. Now, let me introduce our guest today. Carly Pildis has dedicated her career to fighting for justice and equality on a global and national scale. She was named one of 2019 Forward 50 Forward's annual list of influential American Jews. She works for Tikkun Olam, Healing a Broken World, through advocacy, organizing, and writing. She is an outspoken advocate against rising anti-Semitism and currently serves as a contributing editor for Tablet magazine. In addition, she serves as a board member for the JCRC of Greater Washington and the Inter-Jewish Muslim Alliance. She has been featured in Forwarding, Refinery 29, Washington Jewish Weekly, Tablet magazine, The Washington Post, Politico, CNN, and the Jerusalem Post. She has spoken at the ADL Never Again Is Now Summit and National Leadership Summit, the Israel Forum at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan, Z3, the Israeli Embassy, and Results International Conference. In her free time, which it doesn't sound like she has a lot of, Carly enjoys engaging in Jewish Twitter and making Shabbat with her family. Carly, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump in for our viewers. As I mentioned in the introduction, I hear so often from members of my community that it's getting difficult to talk about Israel with their children and grandchildren. So let's lay a foundation for this conversation. Does one generation care for Israel more than another?
Unequivocally, no. I think that this generation cares for it in a different way. I think that this generation loves Israel and is demanding the best version of Israel possible, and shows their love by demanding to see an Israel that really lives up to its stated values and goals. And I think it's similar to how a lot of young Jews treat America. Very critical, and critical from a deeply patriotic place.
That's great. You do have a presentation. You want to start the presentation now?
Absolutely.
Let's get into it.
And while I'm pulling up the presentation, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here and to be a part of these conversations. It really is such an important issue for me personally, someone raising a young Jewish daughter, and, for me as a Zionist. So I'm going to share my screen and walk through this a little with you. Jessie, it says that I can't share my screen. Do you want to pull up the slides, or do you want to enable that?
Let's make you your co-host now. Try it one more time.
Here we go. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So this is Intergenerational Conversations about Zionism. Challenges in communicating about our love for Israel and how we can build bridges. So I'm going to start as a question. What percentage of American Jews identify as critical of Israeli policy?
And we are launching a poll, so this is interactive for those of you who are viewing. We've got some great numbers coming in. All right, just waiting for a couple more people to answer this poll question. I'm going to end the poll now, so if you want to answer, please do now. Okay.
All right, we got a lot of good answers here. Let's see the actual answer. It's 59%. That's the answer. 59%. That's from Mark Melman's poll in October of 2018, defined as critical of Israeli policy. But what percentage of American Jews also identify as pro-Israel? Eight of you are really smart cookies, 92%. So what we're seeing now, and you know, it is a generational gap, not just age-wise, but also just how people view their engagement with Israel. A vast majority of people who are seeing themselves as pro-Israel, and a slim minority that sees themselves as pro-Israel and also as critical on policy. So when we talk about, you know, people who express their Zionism by demanding Israel live up to its values, we're talking about that 59%. Yes, so this is again from the Millman Group. 92% of Americans consider themselves pro-Israel. 59% of American Jews consider themselves critical of Israel. So it's a really different dynamic than what we've seen in the past. Pro-Israel, anti-Israel. We're not talking about loving criticism. So there are some problems with how we talk about Israel with our kids and grandkids that I think really worsen the intergenerational gaps. First, we present Israel as this infallible miracle, and it is a miracle to have ourselves, you know, having self-determination that our people have dreamed about for millennia. But we sometimes fail to talk about Israel also as a real country with a thriving democracy and plenty of room for healthy debate on policy. So when we lead with policy and the idea that policy has to be defended at all costs and not identity or history, then we, you know, stifle reasonable policy debate. Second, when we talk about Israel, particularly with younger, liberal-leaning kids and grandkids, we're talking different languages. And we need to create shared language in order to have productive community-building conversations. So I like to talk about problem one and call it the Santa Claus country, because Santa Claus isn't real. Israel is an incredible place. I've had some of the most incredible, moving, spiritual moments of my life there. But no country is perfect. America isn't perfect. Israel isn't perfect. Japan isn't perfect. It's not possible. So when we talk to our kids and we present an infallible country we don't leave enough room for a diversity of opinion, and I mean of Zionist opinion. So when there's inevitable disagreement, we panic because we want our kids to love Israel. So we try to shut that criticism down. But that strategy of refraining from criticizing Israel publicly is not helping the Zionist cause. It's showing people that they maybe don't belong in Zionism if they have, reasonable policy disagreements that are perfectly healthy for the only democracy in the Middle East. This creates real vacuums and creates real resentments that strengthen extremist anti-Zionist movements. And, when our children discover that Israel isn't a perfect place, they feel betrayed. There's a whole If Not Now campaign called #YouNeverToldMe about really is oftentimes day school kids, Zionist parents, and Zionist communities talking about how betrayed they felt when they discovered that Israel was not a perfect place, and that there were, moments where they really disagreed and felt really pushed out of the community for voicing that. So problem one, Santa Claus does not exist, and neither does a perfect country with perfect policy.
Carly, you mentioned If Not Now. Can you give a short explanation for some people who may not be familiar with this organization?
Apologies for that. If Not Now is I think it's fair to call them far left. I think they would probably call themselves far left as well. Jewish group that's deeply, deeply critical of Israel and has a strong anti-Zionist element. It isn't entirely anti-Zionist, but it, is a Jewish group with Jewish themes and often uses Jewish practice in its protests. That is, really outside the mainstream in terms of Israel criticism. So the big picture here is we need to stop talking about Israel as a perfect place. We need to tell our kids that criticism of when we tell our kids, the criticism of Israeli police, for example, isn't welcome, they will go to places where it is welcome. It's better to engage them in the project of fighting for an Israel they're proud of, even if that doesn't fit your vision, than lose them to anti-Zionism, which is a growing movement, and which they will almost certainly encounter, in college, in high school, in the world. So, one of the things I like to talk about, it's hard to criticize Israel publicly, for me especially, but, my mom's a rabbi, and I'm really proud of her. And I was raised in a really egalitarian, very feminist Jewish household, and Israel does not always live up to that value. I want to be very clear, this is purely my view and not the JCRC's. But so when, my mother and I would talk about women's rights in Israel, and we would talk about feeling really angry that we couldn't pray at the kotel the way we wanted. We're religious Jews, and prayer is very meaningful for us. She said to me, you don't give up on something you love or someone you love because they're not perfect. So instead of becoming someone that was furious that Israel couldn't live up to my grand vision, I became someone who donates to Women of the Wall and amplifies their work, and supports Israelis who share my vision of Jewish values. I would always rather see your kids engage in Israel, and even if it's a policy that you think they're wrong about, wouldn't you rather see them engaging and loving and being a part of the Zionist project rather than walking away? So, some potential solutions. We need to talk more openly about places where we agree on policy criticisms. This will create more opportunity to build trust and talk about what we do agree with. So that example with my mom, if she had just said to me, we don't criticize Israel in this house, or this is a Zionist house, or no country's perfect, but Israel is, we don't talk that way about it here. When you shut that down, it leaves your kids vulnerable and leaves them looking for other places to have those conversations that might not have the values that you have.
Carly, you make a really interesting point. I want to add another anecdote to that. Most of the viewers here, they know me. They know that my upbringing was with my father, Dr. Derfler, who is an archaeologist. my upbringing was strictly cultural when it came to Israel. So on the flip side of your religious connection, mine was cultural. And he left it open for me to question what it's like to live like a Bedouin in Israel, or, you know, things like that. And now here I am, sitting here before you as one of the most staunchest Zionists you'll know. So I think that's such a great point that you're making.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, healthy debate and disagreement weakens extremist opponents by making it clear that Zionism is a big tent of politics. You know, Yossi Klein Halevi is a Zionist, and so is Bibi Netanyahu, and so is Anshel Pfeffer, and so is Batu Ungar Sargon. These are people with really different ideas about Israeli policy and Israeli politics, but they're all Zionists. And we're in real danger of our kids not knowing, especially if they're not spending an inordinate amount of time in Israel or with Israelis, not knowing that healthy debate and, you know, academic rigorousness is welcomed in the Zionist world. So we have to let our kids know that Zionism is a big tent. And I'll say this, stop defending policies you don't agree with or pretending that they don't exist. A friend came up to me a couple weeks ago and was like, aren't you horrified by Israel's guest worker policy for Filipino workers? And I said, in fact, I am. I don't think it's a good policy. I don't like America's guest worker policies often either. I think they're unfair. And that ended the conversation because I had acknowledged I disagreed with the policy, but that I was still a Zionist and I still believed in Israel and I still engaged with it. It's such a powerful tool to diffuse anti-Zionist extremism. So again, if your kids or grandkids are critical of Israel, adding caveats is more productive than shutting them down. So some talking points. I agree with you on that policy. I don't think it's a very good policy, but I'm still a Zionist, and there are Zionists across the political spectrum, and I'd love to keep talking to you about this. Zionism is bigger than any one policy or any one government. Sometimes I'm disappointed or frustrated by a policy decision in Israel, just like in America. That doesn't mean that both places don't have the right to exist. I'm fighting for an Israel that achieves the goal of living Jewish values, and I want you to do that with me. I know it's a really different way of thinking about how we talk about Israel, but I really believe that it moves the needle. What percentage of Americans under 30 do you think have a favorable view of the Israeli government? I don't know if we made a poll for this one, but
I did not.
That's okay. I knew that was going to happen. It's much deeper in the presentation. Just marinate on it for a minute. Only 20% of Americans under 30 have a favorable view of the Israeli government. So with over 70% of our kids, if your strategy for talking with them about Zionism is to defend a particular government, you are not likely to be successful. A couple recent Pew findings, a majority of Americans have a positive view of Israel, 64%. Substantially less feel positively about the Israeli government, 41%. And the gap in positivity towards people versus government is even more pronounced for Palestinians. 46% of Americans feel positively about Palestinians, but only 19% feel favorable towards their two governments. So this isn't just an Israel issue. Some of this, is about trusting governments in general. But my point is, if you hammer at your kids and grandkids the idea that they shouldn't criticize the Israeli government or they're not a Zionist, you really might lose them on the whole thing. And what a shame that would be. I know that's not what anyone on this call wants. So big picture. A lot of American Jews have unfavorable views of the Israeli government, but a substantial have a positive view of Israel. We have to allow more space for people to criticize government policy while remaining pro-Israel and take a less reactionary view of criticism. That way we can build more support for Zionism in the long term. And Zionism is a big tent, and it must remain a big tent. I'm sure plenty of people in this room have been to the AIPAC policy conference. You'll see lots of different types of people with lots of different types of viewpoints on a lot of Israeli policy. That's a good model. Zionism is a place where you can think a lot of different things, but you have to be bought in on the idea of self-determination for the Jewish people in our ancestral home. Problem number 2, I want to talk a little bit about language. When we talk about Zionism, we are often failing to connect with young people, and particularly progressive young people. I am under 40 and progressive. I might not be as young as some of your grandkids, but I trend younger. We talk about security policy, and we don't talk enough about identity, history, and justice. So another thing to think about, the percentage of young Americans who think that national security should be our top budget priority. Most people guess 40%. 7% of young Americans today think national security should be a top budget priority, which gets you thinking about how they view security as an issue and how important it is to them. So we're speaking really different languages. When we talk about security in the pro-Israel community, we're often talking about rocket attacks, bus bombings, wars of aggression with the stated goal of ethnic cleansing and the need to protect Israel and save lives. But you have to remember, people under 25 didn't live through an intifada, and they have not lived through the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War. So when they hear us talk about security, they hear it in a really American context. So they're thinking about a militarized police force and increased police brutality, racial profiling, the Muslim ban, and the war in Iraq, which are very unpopular with Americans under 30, and lives lost, particularly of people of color. So we need to have a shared language. So often when we talk about Zionism and we talk about policy, we lead with security, but that is not going to sway our young people. Instead, we should be talking about Jewish history, about identity, about how Zionism fits into the modern world of social justice and anti-oppression movements. I'll use a big word, decolonialization. Zionism is a decolonizing movement of people taking back their land from colonizers. That is the sort of language your kid might be hearing on college campuses talking about oppression. So Zionism cuts across the left and the right, but when we talk to left-leaning young people who are skeptical of Zionism, we need to be talking about shared values and not leading with security, which is just not a top priority or top value. So some talking points for left-leaning millennials. I always laugh because I am a left-leaning millennial, and these are the talking points I use. They're also the talking points that would work for me or any of my friends. Jews were victimized by colonialism when we were expelled from our homes. We've experienced oppression, violence, and genocide in the diaspora. Historically, we were often left stateless, without equal rights, within a state, and we're deeply vulnerable. We long to return to our home for centuries, and that longing is present throughout our holidays, our prayers, our art, and our culture. Israel has taken in millions of Jewish refugees since its founding, including hundreds of thousands of Jews of color from across the Middle East and Africa. Don't give up on Israel. Fight for an Israel you're proud of. So the big picture. To communicate effectively about Zionism and have bridge-building conversations with younger people. Allow for policy disagreement. Frame Zionism around Jewish history and your personal history, not security. Share stories of people of color who found refuge in Israel, and don't shy away from having conversations about the discrimination they have faced in Israel as well. Jimena is a great resource for this. Encourage them to fight for an Israel they want to see, even if that's different than yours. Critical engagement is better than no engagement or extremist engagement. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Carly. I am just posting in the chat the link for Jimena or Jimena, however it's pronounced. Really very interesting website for you to go take a look at. So thank you for mentioning that. We have gotten some good questions, and I also had questions emailed to me prior to today's presentation, but I want to start with one that's very interesting. Carly, what is your definition of Zionism?
Zionism is the belief in Jewish self-determination in the Jewish ancestral homeland. I believe that, you know, I go with like the really basic big picture definition, and, you know, there's room for a lot of debate within that, and I think debate is a good thing. Generally, you know, my definition of Zionism doesn't have a particular border or a particular policy behind it other than the stated right of self-determination in our ancestral homeland.
Great. One question I received earlier, and one that actually I sent to Carly just so she could understand what some of our viewers might be experiencing. My son and I are very far apart in our views of Israel. I am a Holocaust survivor, and my aunts live in Israel, also survivors. Israel was their lifeline. My son sees Israel as the occupier and the Palestinians the victims. We are not able to discuss it because I get too emotional. Any help is much appreciated. What do you say, Carly?
So, a couple things. First of all, it's a really heart-wrenching issue a lot of families are facing, and thank you for bringing it up. And for sharing a little bit of your history with us. I really value that immensely. A couple things. You know, be open. I would rather your grandson, it was, right? Walk away with the idea that he can be deeply pro-Palestinian and still love Israel than walk away from the idea of Israel's existence altogether. So I think talking about your story, talking about why you believe in Israel, about the role it played in your family history and sharing that, and also hearing his opinions on policy and validating that you care about what he thinks and care about his analysis. And then understanding that, like, the goal is not for you guys to come to an agreement about what you think a final status peace agreement would look like. I can't do that in my own house. The goal is to walk away, agree that you may disagree on a lot of things, but that both of you also can agree on some things, like the value of Israel and the value it had for your family. I will say the biggest mistake people make in these conversations is talking about security, though. Like, talking about your personal story, your family's story, about justice, and leaving room for him to maybe have very strong feelings about the treatment of Palestinians, and that it's maybe okay that he feels that way, even if you don't.
You know, and I would argue, and Carly, tell me if you think you agree or disagree, but I'd argue that showing your emotion, as difficult as it may be for you, is a positive thing in this type of a conversation.
I think so too. You know, I know it's really difficult when you're talking about something like Holocaust survival experience and sharing that. It's an immense thing. That said, I do agree. I think it's good to show your emotion, and not in a way that's designed to provoke guilt, but in a way that's designed to help him understand and be really honest. You know, you also might decide that, like, if it's too hard to sit down and talk, like, start with a letter. Like, I really love you. I value your opinion. I actually want to hear what you have to say about Palestinian rights, but I also want you to understand this about me and understand how our family ended up in Israel and understand what Israel means to me. And maybe you don't even want to sit down at a table. Maybe you want to write me a letter back because it's just too hard to talk. But, you know, clearly if you're talking to me about this, it's eating at you. And I think these are good conversations to have, and they may be too hard to have in person. I sometimes, with my own brother, prefer to do things over email. We're very, very close. But sometimes, you know, everyone can get a word in.
That is an interesting perspective and point of view. Absolutely.
Particularly for someone dealing with the trauma of Holocaust survival. Yeah.
So I want to give a shout out and welcome Dorothy Kushner all the way from Tel Aviv. Hi, Dorothy. Thank you for joining us. We got a really interesting note from Judy Williams. She says, I'm a Black Jew by choice who, despite loving Israel, felt that I couldn't identify as a Zionist because I find myself so disappointed by so many of Israel's governmental policies. As a Jew by choice, I would find myself feeling particularly disallowed from speaking on the topic. However, as a former Catholic who was deeply disturbed and disconnected by the idea of the Pope being infallible, the notion of Israel being infallible made me very sad and angry. This presentation is so encouraging and breathes new life into my love and care for Israel. Thank you so much for that note, Judy.
Now I'm going to be the one that gets emotional.
And to Carly, because you are really helping to break down those barriers by explaining it so well. So thank you for that.
And I will just say, like, again, like, then fight for the Israel you want to see in the world. And like, there are a lot of ways to do that and a lot of ways to love Israel. Like, I was on a Z3 panel where I was really, I was with several Israeli men, and I really dug in on feminism and really dug in on Israeli policy and some of the scripts used as women. And afterwards, someone was like, I thought you were this diehard Zionist. And I was like, yeah, I care about Israeli women. Where are you for them? So, sometimes it's like when you have someone you love and you want to see them succeed. I think that's a good lens for people.
I'm just writing down that note. So another viewer question is, with immersive experiences like camp and physical travel on hiatus, what substitutes exist for parents and grandparents to instill a love for Israel to our next generation?
It's a big question. A couple things. I actually really enjoy a lot of Israeli writers. Yossi Klein Halevi is a big favorite of mine, particularly because he really dives into the issues and doesn't shy away from the hard part. I love Israeli Twitter, if that's something you're into. And, it's hard. Like, the world apartness is real. But I also believe it's really important. The worst conversations about Israel-Palestine across the political spectrum are the ones that treat one side as like a perfect good and the other as a perfect bad. Like, Israel is a place and it's not a parable. And the people there are real. So the more that we can engage with that, whether that's, there's some really exciting news sort of television and movies coming out of Israel. There's more sort of access to the ability to have conversations about Israel online than ever before. But I will say, I always encourage you to go for places that are showing a complex picture, because we never want our kids to feel like they were lied to. Yeah.
I would wholeheartedly agree that the Israeli pop culture is a really strong door to open with the younger generation. I would strongly agree with that. And to address the security issue, all we hear really are some of Israel's top shows about the Intifada or terrorism, like Fauda. But there are others like Baker and the Beauty that are just as fun and approachable and can really open that door.
And a part of why people love Fauda is it's about how it's hard. Like, right, people compare it to The Wire a lot, where not everyone's actually a good guy and not everyone's a bad guy, and all of them are, have their sort of moral and ethical quandaries. That's what Israelis like about Fauda. It's not James Bond. Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't read that. But I will say, anything that allows them to interact with the culture. I love Yotam Ottolenghi's books. And I think food is just another way to do it. And I love Jerusalem, it doesn't shy away from the tensions. So like there's a chapter in the book, it's a cookbook, but it has a lot of writing in it called Hummus Wars, about like who owns hummus and the complicated questions there. And it's a great read. And it's hard not to walk away thinking, I want to go to Jerusalem as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I have another question here. How do you address apathy about Israel to those who don't think it's important or worth supporting?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. And I think, you know, people have to sort of find a way to get there, and you can try to lead someone there, but it only goes so far, especially in this environment where travel isn't possible. But, you know, any touch point you can create to engage with the food, engage with the culture, watch a movie, check it out. And again, talk about why it's important to you, and not in like I'm so mad at you way, and like this is really important to me and I love this and I'd love to share it with you a little. Can we do that together?
Sort of to build compassion.
Yeah, and to, you know, there are all sorts of things I'm interested in because my parents are interested in them and I would not have gotten there on my own. But they showed me how great it was.
Next question for you is, it's very topical, has a couple different words that we use for it, extended sovereignty or annexation. How do you speak to grandkids about this topic?
A couple things. I'll say something I stated before, and I'll be very clear, these are my views and not the JCRC's. Don't defend a policy you don't agree with. I had a really good talk with a family member this week, and he was like, I'm so sad. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, I'm sad. I'm disappointed. I don't think it's a good policy. I don't want them to do it. And it looks like they might, and I cried about it. Like, it's okay to say that. It's actually important for them to say that. And then to say, and I still love Israel, and I still believe in Israel, and, you know, maybe I'm really mad about this or really sad about this, but I still have faith. I still believe and I still love the place. And maybe I'm going to be, you know, investing some time in, you know, there's all sorts of ways across the American Jewish spectrum that people are pushing to try to stop that from happening. Or maybe you do support it and you talk about why and you give your reasons. And then you can say that you agree to disagree. And again, like, Zionism is a big tent. Like, there are now, I think it's 238 Israeli generals who have come out against annexation. Hard to argue they're not Zionists. Like, it's a really difficult conversation. I think honesty is really key. And allowing there to be room to disagree is really key. But yeah, I go back to, if you don't support it, say so. Don't feel like you don't work for a PR firm. You know what I mean? And people can smell that, and you won't defend it well if you don't agree with it.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Another interesting question. I'd like to know the best way to encourage newly converted children and teenagers who know nothing of the beauty and opportunities, lifestyle, schools, and culture of Israel to explore and be open-minded to its plethora of culture and beauty, so they might consider making it their new home.
It's really interesting. And I'll say this, I think there's like a lot of conversation around Jews by choice and how they feel or don't feel. I want to be really clear, we don't have any hard data on the subject. So like, I'm married to a Jew of choice who's a Jew of color who is a diehard Zionist who's generally to the right of me on policy. And we have, I just want to be really clear because you hear a lot of chatter about like Jews of choice and Israel and a lot of like really unexamined fear and bias. So just to be really clear, like, there's no data points and we have no idea. And the truth is, there's a lot of different experiences out there in terms of how people feel, just like there is around any other Jew. In terms of giving people the opportunity to see it. I do think that like there are a lot of people who would love the opportunity to go, to engage. And we need to provide those, there isn't a birthright necessarily for Jews by choice that pays for it for them. That would be a great thing to do. I think every Jew should get a chance to daven at the kotel once. Sorry if I'm more religiously lensed than you, but everyone should get the feeling of, I remember when my husband, walked into Jerusalem and it was he was about to convert, and he went as part of his conversion, and he said, I've never been more sure that I was Jewish, that I was meant to be Jewish, that I am Jewish. So he cried and I cried, and it was beautiful. And my point is, everyone should get to do that. But I think the way you have to do it in a way that lets people ask questions, lets people disagree. When you try to force a really strict narrative and you don't let people ask questions or push against it, it doesn't work. So we had this great moment on our trip, which we took with our synagogue, where we had an Israeli guide and a Palestinian guide. We were walking through Yaffo, and they were arguing with each other. Not heatedly, but I don't agree. I think civilly, but it was, and it was a good experience for both of us. And our trip leader, who was Rabbi Shira Stutman, who's incredible. If you don't know her, she is the head rabbi at 6th in DC, was very much focused on I don't want to provide Jews by choice with a magical country that doesn't exist, this Santa Claus idea. Then when it's taken away, they feel betrayed. And it will be taken away one day. Something will happen. Community, there will be a moment where they disagree with Israel on something. Or if you look at the racial justice work that's happening in Israel now, there was this great quote from this Ethiopian model who's Israeli, and she said, it's great seeing white Israelis protesting for Black Lives Matter, but none of you were here during Ethiopian community-led protests last year. No, you weren't with us, so you're with Americans? I don't understand. That's so disappointing. So, again, I think giving people the opportunity to go and engage and feel how they feel and have the questions they ask, and it's not a perfect place, and it won't be, so don't lie about it. And point them to places where there is incredible organizing happening on Israel on all sorts of justice issues. They could be a part of that.
It's interesting that you mentioned, I think it's Titi, right?
Yes, that's who it was. Sorry, her name slipped my mind.
So, this may not be directly for the person who asked this question, but generally speaking, I think also for Jews of choice and Jews who are born into Judaism, but Jews of color, representation matters just as it matters here in the States. Supermodel Ethiopian. There's Nissim Black, who is a Black Brooklyn-born rapper who, converted to Judaism, and he's full-on Orthodox now, lives in Israel. There are ways to incorporate giving these opportunities of understanding of Israel's beauty and culture without going there yet, because of course right now we just can't. Yeah.
And Nissim Black talks about the racism he's faced in Israel. Yeah. And he doesn't say, I hate Israel. He loves Israel. He's a diehard Zionist. Mm-hmm. But he does talk about it. And he doesn't allow the fight for a more just Israel to be weaponized against Israel.
Fun fact, I was on the same flight with Nissim and his entire family when he was making Aliyah.
That's cool.
2014, yeah. It's hard to miss him in a line on LL.
Fun fact. I like that fun fact. Go on.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've got just about 12 more minutes left. One question that is another very topical question for today. Right now, we see the Black Lives Matter movement. And if a Zionist agrees with Black Lives Matter, but sees Palestinian flags at protests, what does one do?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. So can I do like a big picture? We have a couple minutes, right?
Yes, this is our last question, so take time.
Great. So a couple things. I think one of the places where the Jewish community often struggles to understand Black Lives Matter is we're used to very centralized, very hierarchical organizing and community relations. APAC, the Federation, the JCRC, the ADL, like these are very formal organizations. When they endorse a policy, everyone's bought in. The board has voted. The donors have been contacted. And you can know that like they 100% stand behind it. Black Lives Matter is a very different way of making change. And I think it can be really difficult for those of us in the Jewish communal world to understand because it's completely decentralized and de-hierarchical. There are real pros and cons of both types of models. But so, when someone walks with a Palestinian flag, you can't assume that everyone there agrees with them or even knows what that means. What Black Lives Matter has tried to do is have a very big tent with a very broad idea, in some ways not dissimilar to Zionism. Black people matter. They deserve not to be killed by police. We have to dismantle white supremacy and systemic racism in America. And I would urge you to be really careful about assuming or thinking that people believe things they may not. So I'll give you a really good example. One of the leaders that's really emerged in this moment on a national level is Muriel Bowser here in DC. She's taken it as a real moment to push for DC statehood. She famously changed L'Enfant Plaza officially to Black Lives Matter Plaza and put up new signs and painted it in front of the White House and has set up a very adversarial relationship with the president, particularly on racial justice, and has emerged as a real national leader. There's a very famous picture of her and John Lewis standing there, and John Lewis is tearing up. That's Representative John Lewis, who, if you don't know, is a civil rights hero. And underneath her banner the next night, a group of Black Lives Matter activists wrote, "Defund the police." The next day, she went to DC police and she went to a budget meeting and said, if we want to do police reform, we're going to need more money, not less. We're going to need more body cameras. We're going to need more training. We're going to need billions more to do this right. So this type of really substantive and even sometimes not so substantive debate on policy is really par for the course for Black Lives Matter, even on very core issues. There's even actually fairly serious debate about how much Black Lives Matter should push policy at all. How much should it engage with lobbying, with power structures? How much should it more be a place that percolates ideas about Black liberation? So I tell people this all the time. It's more like the civil rights movement than an organization that has endorsed a deeply anti-Israel platform. And it took me even time to really understand that because it is so different than the organizing world I came up in. But if it's 1968 and Representative John Lewis is walking across the bridge in Selma, Alabama and being beaten and you want to walk with him, you don't not go because of the Black Panther Party. You go. And you disagree with the Black Panther Party. I will also say this, I know no one on this call is doing this, but just to be clear, there are people who I think really try to pit Black Lives Matter against the Jewish community and against Israel and really sort of, for their own political reasons, dig deep into those tensions. I think it's a great way to lose the next generation of American Jews. And, if we push them into this false choice of being a part of this racial justice moment in your nation's history that's the biggest thing that's happened since the 60s, or be a part of the pro-Israel community, I think they're not going to choose us. I don't think that's a frame we want to get in. And I think for a lot of people, it would push them out of Jewish life altogether. So again, if you see someone on a Palestinian flag, I know there are people who will tell you, like, go up and pick a fight. I honestly wouldn't. I would keep walking.
Would you recommend taking an Israeli flag to counter that for optics?
I would, I go back and forth. It depends where, it depends how sort of inflamed the Israel moment in your community already is. And I will say this, there are people who really resent Palestinian rights groups for doing that at Black Lives Matter. Like, I've talked to activists where, like, someone just died. This protest is basically a funeral. Like, we don't actually love what you're doing right now. That sentiment also exists. So I think you have to be mindful of what exactly is the protest, what exactly is the situation. And I think try to be cognizant of the fact that there's an enormous amount of grief in the Black community, and to be frank, in Black communities, because they're pretty diverse right now. Like, there's just a study that came out that a third of Black Americans have lost a friend or family member to COVID. Like, the communities are being completely ravaged by this disease. And, like, while there's some hope in the air, it's also, like, a really devastating and dark time. Think of it this way, like, if I was at the march the march against anti-Semitism in New York, and someone had a sign that was, like, just totally unrelated to my community and our pain, I might not feel really positively about that. Someone in the chat wrote, bring a sign that says, like, Jews for Black Lives. I'm totally on board. But, you know, just because someone else is appropriative doesn't mean that it's good behavior.
You know, I actually heard something that was quite profound. Someone said, don't let the small group of people who seemingly hijacked the Black Lives Matter movement with so-called Palestinian rights tell us who we support and how to support them.
And even more, I totally agree, and even more fundamentally, who we are. Are we people who show up for racial justice even when it's uncomfortable, or are we not? And keep in mind, like, you know, there have always been people making sacrifices to be a part of these movements. Like, think about what women and queer people went through in the 60s, where they were not always so welcomed in those spaces and came anyway. Not that I'm saying you should sacrifice a part of yourself, you shouldn't. But just because someone else has bad behavior doesn't mean you should. And I do think that, like, Karen Bass put it best. She's the head of the Congressional Black Caucus. She's been in Congress a long time. She wrote the police reform bill with Hakeem Jeffries. She wrote, she said on a DCA conference call, she was like, honestly, most people marching at these things don't know about Israel and don't care. Like, there are people who are there to push that agenda, and most people are there because they're really angry about racism and really angry about police brutality. But I really, you know, I do think there are portions of our community, I'm really proud to be one of them, who really have aligned themselves with racial justice. And there are people, as always happens in politics, who are very quick to sort of use fear and maybe exploit some of the real fear of rising anti-Semitism in this community for political gain. So I would just urge you to be really wary of that. And I also think there's a myth that, like, no one at Black Lives Matter ever talks about anti-Semitism. Every organization and every movement has bigotry, has discrimination. We're in the world. They're in the world just like we are. Excuse you, I'm in a meeting. Hi. You want to say hello? I'm going to say bye-bye now. Bye-bye. Anyway, sorry about that. And they're of the world, right? Like, there's anti-Semitism there. There's anti-Semitism on the left, on the right, in every movement. There's sexism, there's racism. But it's not true that no one in that world is fighting against anti-Semitism. Anthony Beckford, who's the president of Black Lives Matter Brooklyn, put out numerous statements after Jersey City and after Memphis, and actually, like, wrote about, like, being on a bus and seeing someone start to scream at an Orthodox family and, like, physically put himself between them and was like, get out, get off the bus. Like, I'm not going to watch you do this. But if you're not reading Black press and you're not following Black influencers and you're not, and I get it, we're all busy, but just because you haven't read it doesn't mean it's not happening. And that's okay. Look, a lot of Black people don't read Tablet in the forward. they're reading the root and the accident. I'm not trying to make assumptions about why that happens. It just does. But know that like those conversations are happening. Like Very Smart Brother, which is a really, really popular sort of comedy politics blog on The Root, which is a huge online black paper, had a whole column about racism in Deshaun Jackson, and it was basically just called him stupid. And it went on and on and on about how unforgivable it was. So like, don't assume that people don't care about you.
Great. That's a great point. You know, we did have a request in the chat to share a book list that you were mentioning before about some great Israeli authors. So why don't we do that offline, and I will send that to the group along with maybe a couple other resources that you want to share to continue learning and continue this conversation beyond the webinar. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Great. So great. We are right on time. I want to thank you so much, Carly Pildis, our incredible guest. We hope that you learned something new and something that will help you with your family conversations. And please, if you do have some of these difficult conversations and use some of the recommendations from today, please share it with us. I would love to know that this webinar helped you. So on behalf of the Jewish Federation, thank you all for joining us, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.